Thank you very much. Thank you. And I'm very happy to come after Jean. Everything he said is very close to my heart. Instead of writing notes, I can tell you that for me, the most memorable things he said were the vital importance of connection, and that the reason things are going so wrong is that we've been on a path of disconnection, and that we need to try to take that deep breath and start from a place of calm to really look at what's going on in the world and to look at how these multiple crises emerged. And there is where I slightly differ with Jean. I see these crises as connected to a system that essentially disconnected us. So from my analysis, after living for many years in an indigenous culture and working in many so-called non-developed parts of the world, working in so-called poorest country of all, Bhutan, I have a slightly different point of view because I've seen that there's an economic system which is essentially a cultural, techno-economic, now all-embracing global system that is pulling us away from nature and from one another, and very importantly, from ourselves. And as Jean was saying, that means that far too many of us, including young people in particular, are spending time on the screen rather than spending time with others, with nature, or in that deeper, happier way with themselves. From my analysis over many years, I've been at this for 45 years now, I would say that the sort of disconnection from nature happened in sort of steps, and there were many historical developments that contributed to this. Some will go back to the idea that there were these goddess-centered female societies that were peaceful and harmonious, and then as those got broken down, we started moving into a patriarchal system. Certainly, when we look at patriarchy, Christianity played not a very pleasant or beneficial role with the witch hunts and the burning of the witches, which seemed to have been part of this build-up, taking us away from a more decentralized, I would say, localized, embedded, nature-embedded way of living that was also more feminine. But in my work, it's so clear that one of the biggest ruptures was with the Industrial Revolution, where you had beginnings of using coal and fossil fuels, accompanied by enclosures where people were driven off the land. This was by force. And global traders that started making use of these industrial processes, use of coal and later on oil, were making use of this cheap labor as people were pushed off the land through regulation. They also went to the other side of the world and enslaved people. Again, this was force, where people were driven away from producing for themselves a range of products for their needs to producing for global traders. Later on, this idea that we should be producing for global traders rather than for our own needs was codified in the modern economy with something called the principle of comparative advantage. And this principle of comparative advantage said, it's not in your interest to produce a range of things for your needs, you should specialize for export. Now, up to a certain point, that makes sense, and up to a certain point, in many parts of the world, this wasn't so disastrous, particularly in the industrialized world, where particularly the traders benefited from having vast populations that had been enslaved. Later they were colonized, and later on they were indebted. So it was a type of debt slavery that kept this market of cheap labor, particularly for big traders. Anyway, I won't go into too much detail, but I do want to say that there's a certain ABC of how the global trade-based economy works. It's a man-made system. It's not evolutionary. Most of humanity was not engaged in creating regulations for enclosures, in becoming slave owners. Most of humanity were not slave owners. This is not a human evolutionary trajectory. It's a trajectory that essentially was started by a few white men. I agree with Jean, let's not spend time blaming them, but let's spend some time thinking about maybe now is time for us to step back, look at that man-made system, and say, is this system taking us towards nature, towards one another, towards that inner peace? Or is it now, after COVID, a path that's trying to drag us even further into a competitive race to get to Mars for more minerals and resources, to make more junk with built-in obsolescence, with technologies that none of us asked for? We have not asked to have life speeded up even more. We didn't ask for 5G. We didn't ask for driverless cars. Where are they coming from? They're coming out of a system which blindly we support because we don't know how to stop it. Excuse me. There's a very clear path for stopping it. It's a path that has to do with paying attention to global treaties. It's a path that means we have to pay attention to that global level to understand that our governments, almost without exception, including my native country of Sweden, these countries are now taking their marching orders from globalized monopolies, whether it's Monsanto, whether it's HSBC Bank, whether it's Cargill, it probably has merged now, I'm not sure, but these mega merged conglomerates are asking our governments to sign in black and white, you need to give us the freedom to do as we like, or we will sue you. And governments are signing, yes, yes, we promise, we won't do anything that might inhibit your profit. Really, what I'm asking you is to just take a little time to look at this and help to join a movement that says, no, we are not going to be allowing our governments to sign contracts that oblige them to take orders from giant monopolies. We want to shift policies to support local economies everywhere. Place-based economies, economies where we know who made our cars, who made our bicycles, and above all, who grew our food. We want to have more connection. We want to rebuild interdependence between production and consumption. And we have woken up to the fact that the most important activities that human beings engage in, how we grow our food and how we rear our children, these activities have been marginalized to shadow work, underpaid, undervalued. What that does to women, what it does to the feminine nurturing spirit, is disastrous. We have allowed this techno-economic path to take us in this competitive direction, faster and faster, more and more divided, more and more frightened that we're not going to have enough money to have a roof over our head, put food on the table, have decent education, decent health care. There is another path. It's emerging from the grassroots, and it's called localization. It is very centered around food. Remember, food's the only thing we produce that every single person needs every day of their life. Our governments are currently engaged on a path where we are further and further separated from that, literally to the point where the food is being imported and exported, the same food. Californian oranges arriving here in Australia, selling for less than Australian oranges when they are ripe and ready. US exports as much beef as it imports, the UK exports as much milk and butter as it imports, and on a daily basis, food is flown across the world to be processed. This is madness, but we don't know about it. Instead, what we get to hear is that we're to blame, that we're too greedy. We don't care. We don't care about climate change. We didn't change our habits. What has changed is the habits of our governments. Left and right governments have been moving in a direction of disconnection. So the path of connection is to rebuild those closer relationships, to support smaller local businesses, to start coming together in our communities. It's happening. It's happening because all around the world, people long for connection. All of us want to feel seen and heard and respected. We want to have a voice. Well, in more localized structures, we can all have a voice. We can have a name. We can know each other. It's very different from the global theater where the known famous person who speaks for 1 minute and gets paid $1 million a minute is where our youth are looking for role models. Once we start coming together in more localized human-scale structures, which can happen in the cities, it's happening even within cities that people become more conscious of the need to reconnect. So, for me, after living in indigenous culture, I would say that the conscious reconnection between people is the most important and the most difficult. When I say the most important, I mean that there's been a huge wave of recovering our spiritual practices, of learning the benefits of meditation, of yoga, of slowing down. There's a whole industry out there. There's also an emerging eco-therapy movement, the understanding of turning towards nature. What's very difficult for us in the West is to connect deeply between human beings. We've been so trained to believe that we've got to be perfect to be loved. So we've been pushed into this competitive path through this economic system that took us away from the land, also took us away from the interdependence, intergenerational interdependence that we had for most of our experience on this planet. This industrial techno-economic path is like 1 second out of 24 hours of our time on this planet. 1 second. Don't treat it as some kind of inevitable evolution. It's a bleep. The evolution that went on was one where we cohabited and collaborated intergenerationally, vitally important for a happier life as we age and as young people. So that coming together again in community, I urge you all to commit, I hope, from tonight to making an effort to change the I to a we. Find a group of friends, find a group of like-minded people, anything from 2 to 3 to maybe up to 20, with whom you meet regularly, in a type of circle where you commit to getting to know each other from that deeper, vulnerable place of imperfection. I have my problems, I have my weaknesses. As people start doing that, they start re-energizing, they start coming alive again. They're allowed to be imperfect and to still feel loved and heard. So that's the number one lesson for me from ancient indigenous culture. But as Jean was saying, I completely agree. Let's not neglect the inner connection that is easily gained just through that attention to breath. There are, of course, many other modalities, yoga and many qigong, all of these practices, very, very helpful. And the reconnection to nature that, for me, is best. Read already? Oh, I didn't see that. The wilderness is sort of my church, but I want to tell you that the people who are reconnecting over soil and seeds and growing food, there is where there's this solution multiplier that is quite remarkable, and I'm seeing it all over the world. We are working in World Localization Day with people on 6 continents. We have a big network, and those local food feasts are taking place on 6 continents. There are several right here in Byron. I hope you'll join us. And this is a way of celebrating a central movement that restores not only our well-being, our spiritual well-being, our physical well-being, but also structural economic benefits that are far greater than you can imagine. Thank you.
Thank you, Helena.